John, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. My name is John Jaspers. I'm choreographer and artistic director of John Jaspers Projects, and I use he, him pronouns. I'm also the director of dance at Sarah Lawrence and co founder of CPR Center for Performance Research. And in this context, we just premiered Visitation. Sorry, I just ate a piece of toast, and that was probably unwise. And really happy to be joined by Jeremy Nelson, who I'll let introduce himself.
Hi, my name is Jeremy Nelson. I have been a choreographer and dancer in New York City since 1984, actually, and I think I have known John since shortly after that time. I'm now full-time faculty at NYU Tisch School of the Arts in the dance department. And yes, I'm really thrilled to be talking to John today. And having seen the show on last weekend, I wanted to find out a few more things and delve into John's creative mind a little bit more. It's funny, John, because a lot of what I've been seeing has been intimate shows at like Kathy Weiss's, Sundays on Broadway and things. So to come to this huge theatrical event it felt like actually there was a hunger in the audience for, like, if you're going to go to a theatrical event, that it really is a theatrical event. And I just wondered, well, first of all, I read what you wrote on Skirball, some of your inspirations. Do you want to talk a little bit about what pointed you in this direction? In a way, actually, I feel it was kind of inevitable that you would end up here, but I'm kind of interested to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, there are a lot of things to talk about, in part because this project was supposed to happen 2 years ago.
Right.
Um, so we started, well, I started on this project in the fall of 2019, um, doing a kind of sort of research experiment period before forming the whole cast, which happened in February 2020. So we had about a week and a half, 2 weeks of rehearsal before we were kind of jettisoned into Zoomlandia. And all the various other kinds of things happened. So I think in part because of that, there's this, it started to sprawl, and there's still seeds from the original thoughts and ideas, but they certainly morphed quite dramatically in response to what was going on, which felt like there's no way to make a piece right now without in some way dealing with, well, that's true at any point. Like, I feel like it's a really intrinsic part of art making, is this response to the moment in history that you find yourself in, the community that you find yourself. Like, I don't know that there's much of anything else to do with art making other than to sort of grapple with those kinds of questions in whatever way comes up. But I wanted to say one thing, which was that, from the very, very beginning, anybody who knows my work knows that I have a perverse and not necessarily always positive obsession with death. And these kinds of questions of our existence in time. And it occurred to me beforehand, well, like, oh, that's so deep in me. I'm, it would be aspirational to think I can somehow just shed that. But I did at the very, very beginning think, like, oh, so much of my attention is sort of like bifurcated in these two sort of directions in time. And one is this attention towards the past, and has to do with issues of loss and these kinds of things. And the other is a kind of death obsession that's towards the future, which is much more about dread, or um, the kind of impending thing, like what's about to happen. So this kind of like past and future attention thing, I was really becoming much more aware, and it wasn't new, but I was really feeling it. Like, oh, I have actually, my attention has created this gap, where I'm actually in the present, but I'm never really as presently conscious or sort of attentive to that moment. Um, and was there a way to not like eradicate this sort of broader question that had figured in my consciousness and also my work, but maybe frame it in a different way and flip the attention back? Um, and what does dancing have to do with that? And what does also maybe a kind of heightened consciousness around queerness have to do with that? That to me was partly, I felt like, oh, if you look at these sort of traits, like the Apollonian and the Dionysian, you see these two sort of sides of a coin. That you could talk about it a binary, and you could talk about gender in relationship to that. But to me, all of these things about distance and thought and cerebral and all of that sit on the Apollonian side, and then the Dionysian side of all of these things about intuition and sensation and whatnot. To me, this really was like, oh, this is me as the choreographer, and this is me as the dancer. And is there a way to bring these into a kind of like deeper dialogue than I maybe had? And maybe think about the ways in which internalized homophobia from my childhood that had got processed in a certain kind of way had actually seeped into how I made work, and had created these sort of like normative roles of making. So that meant like somehow bringing in dancing into the center. Now, originally I thought that was going to involve me, and it didn't. So I'm not so sure that I really did that project. Like maybe there's a seed of that got processed into what we were doing, but it felt like really important to talk about that in this conversation as sort of the beginning. But that sort of sat in a very funny way because I already had a gig at Skirball, and then Wagner was nowhere in the picture, but certainly this kind of question around feeling. And so when I was looking at the world, and I was also looking at sort of like sociopolitics of the moment that we're evolving, and let's just call it passion. Passion-driven action that you see in a kind of polarized cultural sphere, both on the left and the right, on these sides of where people are charged around certain kinds of issues or histories, and then they lead themselves into action with this kind of like collective froth. So that's really powerful. And certainly in my own history, I can think about moments like the AIDS crisis and ACT UP, and certain kinds of activism that really drew power and agency from accessing a kind of energetic groundswell of emotion that then drove people into action that made change. But it also seemed to me like, oh, there's so much power in this, there's also a lot of danger. And then it began to think about sort of like moments in time of, like this sort of immersive feeling, like being swept up in immersive feeling that like liberates me from the tyranny of dispassionate thought.
Well, that's very
there are a
much.
lot of examples of how it goes wrong. and Wagner seemed to be sort of threaded through many
Yeah,
of them.
yeah.
Um, yeah.
And
So
it's
that's a
very
brief
much.
thing.
Sorry, John, I
No,
interrupted
no,
you.
no, please.
No, I just said in response to that point is very much the first moments of the piece, right? Hanro's music, which is such a visceral,
Mm.
irresistible. Your body cannot but experience it, and as you said, it bypasses rational thought completely, and at the same time very ominous. There's you put that front and center right from the very beginning of the piece.
Yeah, wall of sound.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And I think that, to me, that also in relationship to actually the architectural megaphone of the proscenium.
Mm,
It literally is like a frame that is going, shoving visual information in this single direction towards your perception.
yeah, yeah.
Um, so to me, there was an opportunity there to kind of maybe bring us into some experience and hopefully ignite a relationship to thinking about those kinds of things. Not that we shouldn't feel, because in fact, I think one of the weird things about the pandemic was that it really split populations into these two different camps, and I knew so many people who were on the one side. Um, Yeah, the first thing was like arts and culture. It was just like, okay, the whole floor just fell out and there's literally nothing. Like, am I going to have any income? I have nothing to do. I'm like, have just this enormous amount of time that maybe eventually then turned into like, oh, I have all of this time to think and consider like my life and my choices and what am I doing and da, da, da. Then there was the other side, which I very much found myself on. That was just like the moment that it started running a dance program and every alarm bell went off and I was getting up at 7 o'clock and working until 11. It was like, make a plan, make a budget, tear it apart, throw it away, make another plan, make another budget. That kind of thing where there was no time to feel anything.
Yeah.
And to me, the like making this piece was also this kind of very confusing, but really, I feel like I really would have lost my marbles had I not been able to figure out, like, even though it was a completely insane process, I I do think it kept the little scraps of sanity accessible to me, and to me, I also think that's a joy. Like, there's a lot about making dance in this country that I have big questions about. But I do think, at the end of the day, it's really a gift to be like in a room with people who are engaged in trying to figure out some way of grappling with what it means to be a human being.
Mm.
Whether that's through dance or whether it's through some kind of other practice, there's not just one way of accessing it. It just happens to be dance has played a big role in my life, um, in that. And so that feels, I feel enormously grateful for that. So,
Mm. I wonder actually, when you talk about some of the themes that you were exploring in the piece, whether it was like a blessing in disguise when I read that you started with six and you ended up with three, that somehow that served what you were exploring, or probably shaped. It's probably a conversation between the two because they become very much characters, the three
oh, yeah.
dances, and representatives of various. You can project a lot on them. You can make a
Mm.
lot of associations with classicism. With but you name it, you can make it with Houdini. Sideshows, carnivals. You can do all that stuff. It's like this perfect canvas that you can project. Memories. You talk about the seances in your writing about Skirball, and that takes when I was a student, there was this craze for us to have seances, and I would
Oh my God.
yeah
I wish I
yeah
had gone to school where you went.
And I remember, going along for the ride and then manipulating one, actually, and very subtly manipulating one to see what happened. Anyway, lots of memories came back as you talked about memories and projections to the future. So, yeah, I wonder how that zeroing in on just not having yourself in it and having these three particular dances. Um, that,
I knew from the beginning that I didn't. Uh, yeah, it felt like I don't want the dancing to be constrained by me.
mm-hmm,
Um, and Merce made a decision within his work to sort of like have this very youthful, um, vibrant company of dancers, and he functioned as this sort of singular figure of antithesis
yeah,
that was somehow in the group, but absolutely not in the ensemble, like apart from it. And it's just like a model that has never really interested me that much, even though I found myself inadvertently um, in that position increasingly. Um, and I guess in Hinterland, when I danced in it, I just felt uh, like, oh, I'm just one figure in the spectrum of
mm,
different people.
mm-hmm,
I exhibit one particular thing in a spectrum. But like to me, in returning to the dancing centrally, like I really wanted that kind of relationship of people kind of speaking the same language. And I'm going around the circle to get back to your point, um, which is to say that like I didn't have this notion of at all when we started with six of like, oh, we would have these individual figures. And I guess once we ended up on Zoom and I was just trying to figure out what the F are we doing?
yeah,
Because I felt like partly we immediately went on to Zoom in part because I wanted to give a little bit of income stream to people, but I also thought like I'm gonna go crazy. But it became clear like working with six people simultaneously didn't make any sense, And then we started in these duos, splitting up the six into three sets of two. And then there were two configurations of them. And at some point, I guess I was like, is this just going to be a string of solos? Because there's not really any way to build choreographic relationship of substance in this media that I can figure out, or not one that I was interested in. Um, uh, and certainly not one that didn't really speak to the frame, because the whole experience was in these, Hollywood squares. Um, or Brady Bunch Cube, I don't know. Um, uh, so, so I guess, when people left, my immediate response, and it was originally Lee Gambucci and who decided to stop dancing altogether,
oh,
which
really?
was,
I didn't know.
well, they're they're very, they have an amazing spirit and they are very sort of like super air in a way that I'm like, pinched and like, so that just gorgeous. And that combination seemed really fecund to me in terms of a working process. So I was super sad when
Mm,
they decided to not continue with the project. But I'm not sure whether they're performing and doing fashion things, and there's a fluid journey.
mm,
And Eleanor decided to leave New York and had a baby, and was a big life change like that. Um, Both of them, I was just, Eleanor I'd worked with for.
yeah.
I hired her when she was 20, and then we had a big hiatus and kind of came back to working.
Mm,
So I feel, like a kind of intimacy and process that was a big loss. And I originally thought, oh, to to replace. And then I'm like, oh no, there's too much of this. That was already a year into the pandemic when that happened, that we had been working in this way. And I thought, oh, I've got to figure out a way to integrate their loss into the work, because we were already in this whole space of like mesmerism and spirit world, and 19th century spiritualism, and how it related to this kind of sense of feeling
Mm.
and all of the craziness that was that period socially,
Mm.
that I feel like, as a mirror or a kind of other relationship to our time. And ironically, I feel like we're still dealing with many of the issues that they were trying to deal with.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that got set up, and then Xiaoro got a job with Trisha Brown Company, and that too was an amazing loss. But I was like, oh, the cards are kind of set up for this, and I do think that the triangle that was embedded, the double triangle that was embedded in the sixth, then kind of returned back to um, that, and all of the ways in which, sort of like the occult and the Trinity, and, like all of these places that, like, there were a lot of ways in which we could use that structure in a way. But I do think it definitely heightened them um, into these very particular figures that were holding a relationship to the total material in a very individual way.
Mm. What's interesting is I feel like you are very much in the piece because um, there's a there's a distinctive way of moving, kind of almost boneless, weightless, fluid, suspended,
I don't know what you mean.
and somehow in this in this work that those very characteristics serve it even heighten that the sense of being in the ether and being in this spirit non-gravitational world. And actually when we were leaving the show, Bob Eisner, I'm not sure if you know Bob Eisner, he said, no one does these trios and duets like John Jasper's, and the ending trio, where you don't know what's up, you don't know what's down, you don't know what's front, you what's back. It sort of served you perfectly. And I don't know if that was a conscious choice to make that even more so an aspect of the physical language, because the music and the staging is so solid and boom in your face, and then this vocabulary is sort of weaving through walls and yeah.
Well, I mean, I, I don't think it's a big surprise to people that I have an ambivalent relationship to dance, profoundly ambivalent. So, by that I really mean I deeply, deeply, deeply love it, and then I have this aversion and question that sits right alongside it, and so often sort of cause this kind of tension of like, how deep can I go into it, or do I resist? And I will say, when I get back to the where we started the conversation, I really wanted to just say yes to the dress, you know, and to not, and that's very hard throughout the whole process. I'm it like the the reflex action of pulling away from dance, and there's a lot that does pull away from traditional notions of dance. Um, in this piece that's theatrical in a way. But to me, like that, there was that moment of that kind of partnering that I feel like in specifically, you know, is of a time, you know, it feels like time stamped, and it's not necessarily our moment.
Mm.
It feels a little bit like some could perceive it as retardataire, like a throwback to the 90s or something. Um, so I kind of wanted to resist that and just be like, oh, there is something here. Um, to not worry about newness.
Mm.
Um, Newness in a different kind of way, newness within the thing that it is, without worrying whether or not this is corresponding to the fashion of um, contemporary practice. As I mean, that's always been really interesting to me, like that fashion is so deeply embedded in our notion of the contemporary.
Yeah.
And so there's almost like this prescribed notion of these are the materials that can be contemporary and these are the materials that can't,
Yeah.
and can no longer be perceived that way. Or the sort of like kind of like research questions.
Mm.
And I feel like if that once we begin to embrace those things as guiding principles, they're that's a normative version of queer.
Mm.
It's like prescribed, like in order to be queer, you have to have all of these particular attributes, which is just the exact same thing as normativity in a way. I
Yeah.
mean, so I don't actually agree with the statement that I just said, but there's a side of it that uh, I kind of question, and I just was like I trying to let go of some of the notions that sort of prescribe or contain what I do, and then just say, okay, well, this is actually kind of what I do, and why don't I just do it instead of having this tortured dialogue that's superimposed on it? Um, I don't know if that answers the question,
Yeah,
but
no, 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 it does, and a lot of it's about the context for things, and I'm thinking of that duet, the between the two men.
Tim and Doug, yeah.
Yeah, and how you're probably dealing with this within at Sarah Lawrence as well. Finally we're getting back to being able to partner and touch in class and all that kind of stuff. So there's that kind of joy and relief. Oh my God, we can touch again, but like we've kind of forgotten how. It's a little bit tentative. It's a little bit. Um, uh, uh, not that fluidity and sureness of a contact improvisation duet or whatever. So it's this new context for that vocabulary and for that duet creates a newness in itself. We see it very differently than we would have like 3 years ago, for instance.
I don't think, it's like I think about the homophobia of my childhood and that climate and how that is part of
Mm.
um, my sexuality. I think about, I mean, not that that's my sexuality, but that memory can never be fully eradicated or
Mm. Yeah,
erased.
yeah,
And I become more and more aware
yeah,
as I age, things like that, or the trauma of the AIDS crisis and the pathologization of sexuality. That sexuality was, associated for our generation with pathology.
yeah,
It couldn't. There was no other way around it.
yeah,
So there was a kind of like desire that was charged with risk in a different kind of way that was overlaid over the kind of psychosocial charge that
mm.
was from the era of our childhood.
Mm.
And those things, yeah, they're dynamic, and you fight against it, and you do all of these things, and you try and create celebration, but it doesn't make it go away,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know and it changes it, but something of that kind of complexity, so like this naturalness
yeah,
that would be ahistorical and exist somehow outside of a context is a theoretical impossibility. You can't get there because you exist in history. And so you can transform that and rebel against it and be triumphant and celebratory. All of those things are possible, but you can't you can't somehow invent a moment where those things are not somehow lingering or present. And so to me, that was interesting in a lot of different ways. And it's true that then, the double reflection of like touch and the pandemic
Mm.
became a really interesting thing. I mean, I thought a lot about this fact that, at this moment of like summer of 2020 and this reckoning that became very strong around difference.
Mm.
And the exact moment that that's happening, we are privileging all of these senses of distance, which are sight and hearing, already the ones that are valued for years and years and years in our society. All of the senses of proximity, which are touch, shared breath, all of these things that are associated with dance are the very things
Mm.
that we are saying no. Like
Mm.
these are stigmatized or pathologized in a way, and they're the very things that mean like, oh, I have to approach some other, something or someone that I am perceiving as other. I have to somehow step into a relationship beyond my comfort zone. But there's a really good reason at that exact moment not to do it. So I'm not saying, oh, we shouldn't have socially distanced and all of these different things. But the effect of that was that at the very moment that we needed to sort of reach out, we were forced to retract.
Yeah.
Um, and to me, this is where dance has a huge power.
Yeah.
Like, and we have a role. Like, I don't know, I teach in a program where I teach a whole mixture of people. I have MFA students who want to go professionally into the field. I have undergraduates who've never taken a dance class before.
Yeah.
So, but there's a space I truly believe that dance has a power that is under accessed.
Mm.
In the sense that we kind of teach people at a moment when everybody thinks about their like physiological self as a sort of palette to create a curated stream of images and videos that will, create a brand for them on a social media platform. So it's all about like image. This is just for image creation,
Mm. Mm.
you know, and I think there's so many forces that are moving us away from actually this sort of sense of a visceral relationship to being and being with one another.
Yeah.
That dance has got kind of a huge power in relationship to that, in relationship to society, in relationship to education. And I think that we're misunderstood in that way, Um, I mean, maybe it's true that in and through those kinds of vehicles like TikTok that have been about image creation, that people are having a playful or a joyful or some other kind of sense of their being. But I don't know whether it's really about approaching the the perceived other and understanding how interconnected we are.
Mm.
And to me, that the pandemic has been this blunt assertion of that. You know, obviously we're connected. Obviously your behavior affects mine and mine affects your experience. Like the choices that we make are not independent. And yet that's what's so shocking. like you know out of this period that you encounter a kind of political dialogue where, like my choice is like, F you, like this is my freedom. It's fascinating to me. And I do feel like maybe dance has a role. I don't know how exactly we will be empowered to do that. But in the broader sense of it, I'm like, we have power that's undervalued even by ourselves.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know if you saw this piece, but there's a Sasha Valls piece called NC that's based on a Terry Riley score from
Mm.
a composer from the 60s. And basically the premise is it's instant composition, and you decide whether when, and there's a bunch of quite complex rules, but you decide whether to stay with the group or whether to when you can head off as an individual and when it's time to come back to the group. And in a way, it's a perfect metaphor for what had been going. You're fuck you, I'm an individual, I can do what I like, and your responsibility to the group. And I thought that about your piece as well, that dance now is because it is so much about being together and so much about communal agreement. It's kind of very apt moment for it to reflect those issues that you're talking about now, in the way it's organized, in the work that's being made. I think it's very interesting. The one thing about I was speaking to Luis about Bagnolet in was that in the 90s, and I asked him, and I said, did John, I think you won the prize for the most subversive piece in Bagnolet. Was that what it was?
Yeah, I don't know. That was the. I did, in fact, yes. I won a couple of different prizes that year, and that was one of them. So.
And
from Jan Fabre.
Yeah, that's it. So subversive, and yet this kind of very, very emphatic use of structure and detailed structure. So I wonder if that is perfectly compatible to you, or if that creates a kind of push-pull in your work as well, that desire to organize and desire to be, but at the same time desire to fuck things up,
Well, I mean, I remember feeling that because Jan's work, I do think, is very much about like, like he's very interested in that kind of aggression. And I will say, like, discomfort, I think, okay, well, there's a spectrum of energies. When you have that first sound of Hans, that's like, that, I mean, it's pleasurable, not in that it's actually pleasurable, but there's a pleasure in the spectrum of the palette. Yeah. And when it goes away, it creates a kind of energy in the room that you couldn't have without that. Yeah. So yeah, I'm a little bit like, I would like to embrace a broad thing, but I also think, in accessories, I wasn't trying to be subversive. I was just trying to be honest.
Yeah.
And so that felt somehow that was a subversive thing to do, there was a lot that was just as uncomfortable in its original research stages for me as it was perceived to be for the public. Mm. So I don't think, I've often talked about the fact that I get bored with my own repetition. And so I have to create structures to eliminate possibilities that feel I'm predisposed to, that force me to go like, down the path that somehow feels dangerous or uncomfortable. Yeah. I mean, anybody who thinks that I was like, easy peasy of trying to use like the world's most problematic white guy in the white Western musical canon, doesn't really know me. Like the amount of back and forth, I'm like, oh my God, like this is crazy. But there is something that attracts me to these things, that like there's something there, but I feel like it's like there's danger. Well, that danger, or that whatever that sensation is of discomfort, is about the unresolved. It's like about the something that's unknown or something that feels wrong. I mean, you can do really bad things in that space. Like, so you have to be careful. Like, but I do think that, and that's where it's like subversive gives that notion of like, there's a distance and it's just like that, this kind of freedom of like, I'm going to disrupt. Well, disrupt, but disrupt in a way that has a productive outcome and not a destructive one. And that is actually very, very hard to do. It's easy to burn the house down, but why? what do you want to get out of that? What is created out of that disruption? And to me, that's where um, I just hate the fact that the word conservative has come to mean this kind of thing. And I know this is a very weird place to sit, but I'm just like, well, I care about, I care. It should be about care, you know, about like, oh, we have these things within us. It's not like death or not living or progressing or evolving. It means like, oh, there's this thing like conservation, like, plants. I want to take care of plants. I don't want the forest to burn down.
Yeah.
Like, those kinds of values that are about sustaining something over a broad period. But instead, it just means like, this obliterated like notion. It's come to mean like, something very different than care. And I don't, it's not to say that I am like I'm conservative, but I do think that I would love for us to be somehow engaged as a culture in a deeper way around these kinds of broader issues of not just me and my moment, but like where do I sit in the arc of relations that some of which are temporal to generations past and generations future, some of which are interrelational in our same time space about like, oh, how do I kind of connect and understand that the choices that I'm making are nurturing the broad spectrum, not just me and my little experience here, but somehow, like people used to ask me this about CPR. Like a critic was like, well, I don't understand. How is this beneficial for you? And I'm like, well, it isn't. If I was only thinking about it in those terms, it doesn't make any sense. But then if I think about, oh, like investing in a particular kind of way in allowing this thing to happen that might then like nurture a whole other community that might be doing work that's completely different than anything that I ever was interested in, but is somehow connected through a broader sense of like, oh, they want to ask the questions that are their questions in the same way that I'm trying to ask the questions that are my questions.
Yeah.
Like that kind of connectivity, we need more of that. This sense of individuality that has dislocated itself from connection is a real problem for our moment and our culture. And I feel like, any way that I can be involved in kind of trying to flip that paradigm, I think it's a positive
But
thing.
one of the questions I was going to ask you, because I think there's a piece, is it Within Between? Is that the name of the piece? Yeah, where you very consciously wanted to not do what you do, and I had thought of the use of Wagner being an extension of that, like what what happens if I take on this thing that's that I would never normally do, and it's this huge challenge. And I just wondered if there were areas moving forward that you would like to explore like that, that's going to push you or reveal things to yourself about your own creativity that you don't already know.
I mean, this piece was very, very hard to get up, and I originally thought, oh, this will be an easy, like a simple piece, and like there's a relationship to like as my resources are much less than they once were, the quantity of personal labor, and I'm not talking about work, I'm really actually talking about like physical labor, has gone stratospheric. And I don't have the energy that I had at 37. So I was just really like, I just can't do this anymore. Um, and yet I realized like, oh, long form is my thing, you know, I don't know, a pleasure in enjoyment, but like I'm good at it, I think. It's demonstrated after 37 years. I have some chops at creating these sort of longer relationships. And so I can't imagine not doing it, but something has to change. um, in a big way. Um, and the other thing that I think about right now is that I have really, you know, as my body has changed over the years, and I have arthritis and whatnot. I have kind of not really figured out a way to understand that in relationship to my own practice.
Mm.
So the solution so far has been to push it to the side, you know. Um, like I'm still engaged in making material, but usually that I have to be very careful, and it involves kind of gritting through and approximating a relationship that is as much about a memory of my body potentially having been able to do that, and then combining it with an experience that I'm seeing, in the bodies that are more useful. But that's, to me, there's something I'm like, oh, I have just internalized all of the ageism that is everywhere in society. And here we are in this embodied form that is already hyper ageist. Is even more than the main culture, and has done only a little bit in recent years to really acknowledge and sort of try and address that.
Yeah.
Um, so like this next project, I'm spending quite a bit of time in the studio by myself, which I hate. Um, or have hated, and trying to find a way of loving that,
Mm.
you know,
Mm.
and finding something inside of, like, not just like grunting through it, but really trying to figure out, oh, what can emerge through that. I mean, I really don't know what that means, because there is truth that some movement really does create pain, and I'm like,
Yeah.
I'm not interested in pain.
Yeah.
I'm interested in a different kind of way, and thinking about artists like Kazuo Ono or
Yeah.
others who, I mean, he in particular, because like I remember seeing Kazuo perform when he was 93 in Tokyo, and it was just one of these moments where, like, they were like, is he going to perform? And he was doing a thing with Akira Kasai at Spiral Hall in Tokyo. And like, I sat in front row, and they were like, well, we won't really know until the day of. And even then, we never really know, but something will happen. And Akira will either do a solo or he'll do this duet with Kazuo. So Kazuo did end up performing. And at that point, he couldn't stand up, and he could kind of sit on the floor and move his arms. And it was just, I mean, one of the most stunning performance. And I'm like, it is not a stretch or hyperbole to say he could die right here in front of us. Like, that could happen. And he just had this, like, he just wanted to give it all away,
Mm. Mm.
you know. And there was this kind of sense of joy and um, generosity
Mm.
in the act of dancing. It wasn't about this, but was really just like
I
giving
wonder.
energy out to the world. Yeah.
I wonder if it's about acceptance. You mentioned, like, past and future. It's like, myself having just had my second hip resurfacing. I know exactly what you're talking about in terms of clinging to that memory of, this is what it used to feel like, or this is what I used to be able to do. And what an inhibiting factor that is. And there is, it's a cliche, the aging body learns how to do things much more efficiently and with much more depth of experience and all that kind of stuff. But in what you described, it's absolutely true. It's just not measurable in the terms that we used to,
Yeah, but
almost.
there are these individuals.
Yeah.
Like, I'm going to say something. I'm interested in people who have invested and have been thinking about these kinds of, like, embodied experience. Like, there's something that I can watch there when I see Vicky Schick,
Yeah.
or you know, um, Meg Harper,
Yeah.
or Steve Paxton.
Yeah.
Each one of them, it's like oh, you can see that they've been doing, like they've been working on this in different ways for a lifetime, and that is in them. Like, you know, I love older people and they've been really inspiring, but if they haven't been doing that, generally speaking, I'm not so interested in watching them as a performer just because they're older,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
know. Um, so there is this kind of question of depth of practice that comes into play. And so it is, yes, about accepting that, oh, that chain of like, my body used to be able to do this and now it can't. But it's also like not letting, there's a piece of the information there that can be repurposed and translated into something. And that to me is the kind of question and interesting thing of like, is there a way to, because the way in which I've done that is through my eye. Largely I move my, like there's a little piece of nugget of my physicality and largely my eye and my voice in terms of the communication I have with younger people, then becomes the methodology of like, oh, trying to bring them or guide them through what I see and through how it relates to my memory, and then sort of like, oh, well, why don't you try it like this or think about this, or
Yeah,
you know
yeah.
but to me, there might be other ways that I haven't really necessarily explored so much that feels like a part of what maybe the next step in the journey is.
Mm. Well, actually, I think we're down to our last question, actually, but you kind of segued into it in terms of uh, your teaching. You teach creative research and composition as well as contemporary practice. You teach everything at Sarah Lawrence.
Well, yeah, but mostly, I mean, the big center is around the lifetime based art course,
Uh huh.
which I've co-taught with other artists, Dean Moss,
Uh huh.
Beth Gill, sometimes Juliana May. Gennaro Castro is co-teaching with Beth in spring. Um, so artists who I feel like are asking tough questions and pushing the form forward in different kinds of ways.
Yeah.
So, and then I've taught lighting recently. I'm not teaching that again, hopefully, just because that's been a big part of my practice. And occasionally I teach movement practice, but not always. And then composition, improvisation, stuff like that. So I do think, this year I'm on sabbatical and a halftime year-long sabbatical, so I won't be teaching at all this year. And there was a moment when I was like, oh wait, you're taking away the part of my job that I enjoy, having me do the harder part that I take much less pleasure. um, but yeah, it's interesting to me these kinds of questions of I've always felt like the teaching and the making kind of are tied to one another. Like I can't really do the one well without the other. And the teaching also sort of pushes you into a relationship that is bigger than the self. And I think that, one of the tough things about dance, particularly in this country, is that in order for, I mean, it shouldn't happen. Like, let's just face it, it's like you have to have this will to will the thing into the world, and the kind of connection of resources that you need to assemble to make it happen, even on a fundamentally simple level, are massive. So that can tend to create a kind of megalomania that is a precursor or a prerequisite for making. I don't think that has a positive effect on the actual work. I think the actual work can tend to somehow be impaired or burdened by the very personality traits that seem to be required in order to make work at all. Um, And so to me, the teaching is a countervalent thing where you're like, oh, I'm not the only person in the room here. Like, let's be reminded, like,
Yeah.
there are these other voices. They have other concerns, sometimes that are, in fact, diametrically opposed to the things that I care about.
Mm,
And so, how do I learn to care
mm,
about that? Even when, so it means like, sort of like, my role in being my full self is also about muting some level of, or not, it's not about muting as an oppressive thing. It's about understanding, like, I'm just one fish
mm,
in this larger pool. And how do I function to assist the ecology?
mm.
You know, what's my role in moving the discussion forward? Um, And you can lose that sometimes as an artist. You could think that you're doing that and you can fool yourself, but there's really no like, when you lose track of that as in inside of the classroom, immediately.
Yeah, yeah,
You know.
yeah, yeah. Well, John, it's been great, wonderful talking to you.
Yeah.
Enjoy the rest of your week unplugged and getting lots of uh, yoga classes and beach and
You said, because we were trying to reschedule this at a different hour in order to facilitate a yoga class,
yeah.
and Jeremy was like, "Well, I don't want to interrupt your yoga practice," and I was like, "Let me just be clear: there's no yoga practice. It's a desperate effort to get back to some ongoing thing." So, first yoga class I will have taken in like 3 years.
Anyway, lots of luck for your all your upcoming projects, and we'll see each other soon. And thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy. Always a pleasure.
Yeah.
Always a pleasure. Yeah.
Bye bye.
Bye.